Hi, and welcome to Ed Talks. My name's Anne Dymond, and I'm a Board of Governors teaching chair here at the University of Lethbridge. I want to start by acknowledging that we're situated here on the lands of the Blackfoot people in what's now Treaty 7 territory, and so I also want to say Oki Nitsu Kuawa, which means hello and welcome to our family and friends. I'm here today with Dr. Carmen Mombourquette, who's an associate professor in the Faculty of Education, and so I want to say welcome, Carmen.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I'm glad to meet you. Maybe we could start with just talking a little bit about how you came to be a teacher here, and I think you're in a especially interesting position to talk about teaching with because you are a teacher of teachers. So how did you get here?
Great question, and thanks for that, Anne, and it's a pleasure to be able to do this as an extension of our work at the university. My teaching days go back almost to when I was a child. I was involved actively within what is known as the Army Cadet Movement of Canada.
Oh, okay.
And at a very young age, I was entrusted with some leadership roles and started teaching younger cadets some of the stuff that we need to know. And I thought, this might not be a bad thing to do as a career. So when I graduated from high school onto university, I went to that East Coast University, St. Francis Xavier,
right.
Wear this little X-ring on my finger still, and kind of harken back to days that I had an awful lot of fun and actually learned a little bit.
And do students think you're an X-Man now?
And the students think I'm an X-Man. Most look at it and say,
What?
And I
Secret
said,
powers.
Yeah, we don't know how to sign our names, so we can do this. Once I became a teacher, I ended up here in the province of Alberta, like so many East Coast young people.
Yeah.
Alberta for many, many years has been a land that we seem to all migrate to. Once I became an active teacher, fell in love with the idea of service to others. And I think even as a young beginning teacher, my sense of, and I was teaching junior high school at the time, and many junior high school teachers will probably laugh at what I'm going to say next, but I really tried to focus in on getting to know really intimately my students so I could serve them in the best way I possibly could. And then I went on and very quickly became a vice principal and principal, and I spent the better part of my career as a school leader in addition to being an active teacher. Throughout the course of my K to 12 years is what I would call them, the idea of returning to university and continuing to study was very real to me.
Right.
Because I became a vice principal at a very young age, I think I might have been 25 or 26 at the time, helping to run a school with close to 400 or 500 students in it. It was a big responsibility. I recognized I really didn't know what I was doing. Went to the University of Alberta, took what was called a graduate diploma in educational administration. Really excited me about the study of the theory of what is behind this specialization that we used to call educational administration and we now call educational leadership. And then from there, it took me to a master's degree at the University of Victoria, where again dug even deeper into really what's involved in the study of this discipline. And then how can I take that? How can I take the theory and apply it to my daily practice? And so often, I still hear with my students who come into the master's program that I help to run, almost just a touch of cynicism between, well, that's okay, that's what we learn there, but that's not what we really have to do over here.
Right.
And I strive to somehow mesh those two worlds. And I'm partly successful in doing that because I was able to bridge it in my own study and come to recognize this isn't just theory.
Right.
The theory helps form the practice. And then I continued in my life. And then at one point in my life, an opportunity to take a doctorate in educational leadership came along. Zero desire, by the way, to ever become a member of faculty at a university.
Right.
It was still with the desire to know more. I wanted to be able to not only read the research.
Right.
I was curious then, as many of us would be when we enter into doctoral programs, how do I create my own? How do I take this wealth of information that I'm learning almost daily with interaction with my students, with my teachers, with the parent community, and start to make sense of that as well. So once I had finished that doctorate, a neat opportunity in life arose, and I ended up leaving Alberta for the city of Toronto, where I ran an independent private school for a little while. And in the course of all of that, a good friend of mine who I now research extensively with here at the University of Lethbridge, phoned me up and said, Carmen, this professor spot on the Faculty of Education is open. Why don't you apply? And that led to very long conversations back and forth with my wife, and I ended up applying, and I ended up coming here.
Right.
With the desire of, how can I make a difference in the lives of young men and women who want to become teachers? But I would even say, and even more so, well, how can I make a difference in the lives of men and women who are already teachers but desire a leadership responsibility?
Right.
And how could we help craft in some way an opportunity for them to really excel in coming to know the theory so that they can apply it to their practice?
Right. Oh, there's so much there I want to circle around to, and I hope we get to touch on lots of it. Not least, I was an air cadet, so also came to teaching at a young age in certain ways. But we don't need to fight about the values of
the merits of either. Yes.
I'm especially interested in the difference between theory and practice, because from my perspective, there's always this thing of, if the practice and the theory don't mesh, it's bad theory, right? Like, the theory needs to actually work in practice, or else the theory is not actually explaining what is happening. And it seems like you are also working from that perspective, getting leadership to be aware of the theory so that their practice is like a best practice, we might say. Can you tell me more about your research on leadership?
Excellent follow-up question, and ready to go in that direction. And it really is an extension of what you just prefaced it with. I agree. Unless it's good theory, it's not really going to mesh or work its way out in practice. But yet at the same time, so many of my colleagues that I've been able to listen to over the years around principal tables, and principals have numerous meetings.
Right.
One of the little chuckles I often have to myself, now that I'm a member of a faculty at a university, with our service component, which really means sitting on a plethora of committees, our committee responsibility at a university is minuscule when compared to just the amount of time people in the field working inside of schools spend hours after hours after hours working with each other in some version of committee format. So I spent extensive amounts of time doing that. And as I would listen to some of my colleagues speak, so often their language was centered on themselves. It was the infamous N of one, or the N being their school, the N being simply their own practice.
Right.
Without that broader perspective of understanding where and from where what it is that they're doing really rests, so that they're able to start to make connections between various elements of their own practice, how they do their jobs, impact it has on teachers, ultimately impact it has on students, and allowing them to continue to grow. That there almost seems to be, in some instances, a missing link there.
Right.
So now what I try to do within my research component within this faculty is to come to understand, what is it about educational leadership that makes the biggest difference in the impact that it has on teachers and their teaching that ultimately leads to
more success
with students. Kid learning, student learning. How can we arrange, organize, put together a school program so that their influence of that school leader can actually influence the ways in which teachers teach, leading all the way to which students learn? That's kind of the underpinning of what I'm currently researching.
And what do you find are key markers in that?
Well, fascinating with all of this. At the same time as I joined the Faculty of Education, which is 10 years ago now, so in university worlds, I'm still somewhat of a newbie. Even though I'm an old guy in white hair and all the sort of stuff. And I spent close to 30 years as active within school, and now I'm almost 10 working full time at the university. So I got a blend of multiple worlds. At the same time as I joined the Faculty of Education, the province of Alberta, through Alberta Education, after multiple stakeholder conversations, and that actually is one of the hallmarks of Alberta. And if I only had time within an already overpacked research agenda to explore another element of Alberta and Alberta education, it would be just the monumentalness of stakeholder involvement in decisions that are made in this province in the K-12 world. And I don't know if we see it as actively at the post-secondary level, but at the K-12 level, it is hugely active. When the province decided that they wanted to take a clear look and help define what are the essential ingredients behind what we would call the principalship or educational leadership, they brought together all of the folks who would be involved. The Alberta Teachers Association, which in some respects we would call them the Teachers Union. The Superintendents Association, called CAS. The Home and Schools Association, which became the School Councils Association. The Independent Schools Association. In some provinces, we almost see, can almost be described as a bit of a war between the independent schools or the private schools and the public school system. In Alberta, there's a very neat connection between formal hierarchy between superintendents, Alberta Independent Schools Association, Alberta Teachers Association, and often they're sitting at the same table together. And in the Albertan way, they also pull together university representatives. They knew, because we are the people with the ability to do the research and start to come to understand all of the underpinnings at play here.
And experts in curriculum development, right?
Experts in curriculum development, but in this case also experts in educational leadership.
Right.
We understand it from a theoretical perspective and how that is applied to practice. So these groups are brought together. And over a course of almost 10 years, we've come up with an understanding of what education leadership means.
Right.
What I've done is to try and dig a little bit deeper into each one of those elements. A few years ago, a colleague of mine, Dr. George Bernard, and I wrote the only book really on educational leadership in the province of Alberta that centered on what was known as the competencies that underpin educational leadership.
Right.
And at that time, I interviewed a plethora of highly successful school principals from one end of Alberta to the other, trying to dig deeper into items like the importance of vision in their leadership and the role and the way in which they help develop it, but just as importantly, the way in which they communicate it. What about their role as instructional leaders? At one time, and perhaps maybe even when we went through school, principals were very often seen as the building managers.
Yes, quite removed from
the day-to-day interaction of what happens with students inside classrooms. That's no longer the case.
Yes.
An instructional leadership mandate is entirely different. And what about even leading what we call now leading a learning community? How do we put teachers together in such a way that they can actually draw from each other's strengths?
Right.
What does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that actually taste like inside of a school and school life? Those are the areas that I'm digging deeper and deeper into now.
Okay. Can we maybe shift the focus a little bit?
Because
you research the K-12 system, but we're here thinking about teaching in the post-secondary. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about what courses you teach here, and I guess I'm especially interested in how that relates to your research, if it does.
Intimately.
Of course.
Intimately.
Yeah.
And again, great question. In the Faculty of Education, it's either written or unwritten, I'm not too sure which, but we have a rule that says all of our professors will do field placement of student practica.
Right.
So doesn't matter if my primary teaching responsibilities at the graduate level within the Masters in Educational Leadership program or not, I go out and I supervise students in the field.
Right. And so maybe what is the practicum?
We have almost 3, but it might even be construed as 4 levels. We have a course that's called Ed 2500. Students go into schools, get their toes wet, begin to feel whether or not they actually want to come into the faculty and become teachers. Phenomenal program.
Right.
It's too bad every university in the country doesn't run one. Then once they get into the faculty, they do a professional semester 1. Little bit of teaching, starting to take what they're learning as theory inside of their coursework and apply a little bit of it.
Right.
Then they go into what we call a professional semester 2. Much more teaching, highly centered and focused on whatever their teaching major is.
Right.
So if their teaching major is social studies, the likelihood is they're involved in an area where they'll be teaching a lot of social studies.
Right.
And they will get one of our curriculum specialists quite often supervising them. Then as a kind of a finishing ground, we have what is called professional semester 3, which we also call our internship. They go into schools for an entire university semester, teach for fully one half of the day,
Right.
deal with other university-related coursework during the other half of the day, And they, in essence, take over the class from their cooperating teacher. So when I get to go and supervise, that's the group I often supervise.
Okay.
And it does two things. I spent my life as a school principal. I think I understand what to look for with beginning teachers and how to shape and mold and help refine them a little bit by working very closely with them.
Right.
And trying to figure out how can I also best serve them. So when we come together as excuse me, small groups and what we call seminar, it's centered on their needs. It's not on what I think they really need to know.
Right.
Even though somehow some of that flows together as well. So that is one of the teaching responsibilities we have. If I teach in the undergraduate level, I also do a course that's called Social Studies for Non-Majors.
Okay.
And it is just what it sounds like. Throughout my years within the K-12 world, in addition to being a principal, my teaching background is social studies, so I think I have a little bit to offer.
Right.
Currently, the province of Alberta, as you probably heard in news broadcast, is reviewing curriculum entirely from kindergarten to grade 12. I'm one of the members of the curriculum working groups dealing with this new social studies curriculum, which I am in total favor of. It is not a socialist plot. It is really centered on how we can help children learn and concepts and ideas which will help carry them through into adulthood. But anyway, it's a different story, so I teach that. But the area of my teaching that I really what brought me to the university was to be able to teach within the master's program, to help co-lead the educational leadership specialization, and that is where I think most of my research comes into play on a very regular basis.
Okay, so I don't know that much about the graduate programs in education, and I know there's a relatively new graduate program, and then, can you tell me about?
We have a number of specializations, and then we also have a major, and the major is in education leadership. We have a specialization in neuroscience, which is a neat cooperation between our faculty as well as our colleagues over in neuroscience. And from many of the teachers who come into that program are thinking they would like to become learning support teachers. Maybe at one time we would have called special education teachers. They really want to explore an understanding of how it is that children learn in its fullest depth and meaning. Then we also have a specialization in literacy, which pretty self-explanatory when it comes to the world of education. And we also have one in the area of what we call curriculum and assessment. The assessment piece, which is very interesting here at the post-secondary level, has truly taken on a life of its own within the K-12 world, and making a big difference in the way in which we come to know what it is that children know, and then to be able to report that back. So that whole specialization is centered on those two ideas, the blend of what it is that children should know, curriculum, and how do we get to know what it is that they know, which is the assessment piece. And
educational leadership, you must have.
And then we have the educational leadership, designed primarily for folks who would like to explore that leadership function, very often phrased as want to move into something like the principalship.
Right. And so that is both a master's in education as well as a PhD in education?
No, it is just...
It is at this stage? For
the vast majority of our students, it is a master's degree in education leadership, but we have our first cohort of students going through, and we have 3 that are doing a specialization in educational leadership.
Right.
2 who are... One who is a practicing school principal, one that we actually have on faculty with us, and one who is a member of our university community in Calgary. And hopefully all 3 will complete very soon.
Interesting. How does your teaching change at those different levels? Like, we're always interested in excellence in teaching, but excellence in teaching looks different in different terms. Can you...
You know, there's one part that remains the same. And if I go all the way back to that early part of the conversation when I spoke about my junior high school students, and it was me trying to figure out them so I could better serve them. That part has remained constant, whether it is at beginning students within our B.Ed program all the way to when I work with our PhD students. That it's my job, not their job. It's my job to figure them out so that I can help serve them in a way that will let them grow and prosper as young academics or very seasoned academics.
You know, I've had the privilege here of interviewing many of the excellent teachers on campus, and in in all of them, in some way that has come up, that excellence in teaching is about what they need, not about me saying it. I said it perfectly, but they didn't understand. It is not excellent teaching, right?
It's not excellent teaching.
And so, yeah, that comes up again and again, and it really resonates with me.
Nice, good, and pleasing to hear that.
Yeah.
So with the undergraduate students, it in many cases, particularly because the classes are larger, and with more students there, it takes longer to also figure out what they need from me so I can help them learn. But we figure that out. Then at the master's level, the groups are smaller. Their needs are really diverse.
Right.
They all intent on going on to becoming leaders in some realm within school. But leadership is such a wide breadth of practice within schools. The more I know about them and the more we talk and the more I find out, then we start to tailor assignments. Then we start to be able to let them be able to dig a little bit deeper into areas that's really pertinent to them.
Right.
So that their learning becomes, even though I don't have a preordained plan as to how their learning is going to be tailored to their own needs, very quickly their learning does become tailored to their own needs, and therefore they're able to grow in perhaps areas that they weren't even aware of when they entered into the faculty. That becomes the tricky part of it all.
The tricky and the rewarding part, I
Absolutely.
imagine. And I imagine the students in the program are already on board with the idea that leadership can be something you study and can be taught. But you must encounter resistance to that idea, because I think many people in the world think leadership cannot be taught. It is interior to us.
And the way we get around that is, and part of it, I go back to, again, the work of the province. We have defined for the K-12 school world 9 competencies that make up a leadership standard. And those standards, or the competencies within that standard, provides great food for conversation around what is leadership,
right,
and what does it look like. And then students start to think about, okay, visionary leadership.
Right.
It is not a one-off kind of innate, highly charismatic person being able to stand up and rah-rah and everybody follow them.
Right.
It's being very clear in what it is that we'd like the organization to be able to achieve, and then be able to articulate what that vision is so that others can understand. And how do you bring the larger group into sharing within that understanding? And charisma might help get there, but it doesn't get there.
You know, that description to me, I mean, I really think that good teaching in the classroom is almost the same as that description you've just given, right? That it's about actually clearly articulating what the goals are, and making the participants on board with those goals, in however that works. As you said, at the graduate level, it's because they're on board because they've helped determine those goals to some extent, right?
They're there.
Yeah. One of the things I'm also interested in, and I think you have some experience in, is inclusivity in the classroom. And I know that that's important to educational leadership, to principals, but it's also important here on campus. How do you make your classrooms here more inclusive? How do you make your principals aware of inclusivity as an important issue?
We build into literally every course that we have within the master's degree in educational leadership various items that might be connected to this bigger idea of inclusion. That students are individuals. It's not the entire group. And almost with that, my own philosophical position to which I come to teaching, that I must serve them. And in order for me to serve them, I need to know them.
Right.
And in order for me to know them, I have to spend a great deal of time talking, probing, just listening to what is being said on an individual basis, their conversations in groups, and reading the paperwork. The paperwork that comes with students. We have students at a master's level with highly experienced teachers that have learning support plans. And we have students that go through our master's program that will have already ordained for them tutors on the outside, folks that will help them with writing, We have students that will come in with certain physical disabilities, and we have to take account to that. So, and the blessing of the university is we're sort of set up to do that. We are nowhere near as well set up to do it as what school divisions themselves are. And partly because the need is so much greater within a regular K-12 school, so that they're faced with it every day much more than we are. But that understanding of coming to know students and then following up with what they need as an underlying premise, if we're demonstrating it actively within our B.Ed program, we're demonstrating it actively within the M.Ed program, then the likelihood is they're going to also carry that through and find ways that they can also continue to do that within their practice experience when they're out in schools.
Right. And in terms of, I'm interested, you've mentioned a few times about tailoring things. Can we talk about specific assignments that you would be giving that are constructed by you to allow you to tailor them? Do you have examples?
Actually, a really good example is a feature of our education leadership program that is rather unique in the entire country. And that is, we have 2 of our 12 courses that are built around internships.
Okay.
If we go to almost every other Canadian university, if you take 12 courses as part of a master's program, it's all purely academic stuff covered in the side of a classroom. And that's just the way it goes. The folks that created our program recognized it, read the literature, they read the theory that was coming out of the English-speaking world, saying students of leadership need to have the opportunity to be able to come to know within the theory, but then to take that under guidance and support. But that's the tricky part. Guidance and support of somebody who understands the theory, as well as somebody within the context in which they're going to put this into practice. So very often that would be a teacher's principal, or it might be a superintendent with me or with my colleagues who will supervise these internships, so that they can put into play what they're learning in theory. Now, when they have to design what that internship experience is going to be like, is truly student driven. They know the context of their schools. They know what aspect of their learning so far is really striking a positive chord with them. That's not for me to tell them that they have to go out and lead a professional learning community. That's for them to decide. And because they get to go and take a look in their schools, speak to their principal, speak to the superintendent, find out an area of need within the school, and then to be able to craft an internship experience coming from that part of the theory that they know might impact in a positive way inside of that school, refined by me, because I want to make sure this also meeting all of the academic integrity that would be consistent with a Master's in Education program. Then they go put it into play. Now, you can't tailor anything more to individual students than what that is.
Well, and I'm interested in the relationship between that and the undergrad education degree, because it seems similar in certain ways but different in others. Is that?
Well, and part of that experience was, if any university in the country would offer an internship at a graduate level, it would be the University of Lethbridge, because of the long-standing nature and terrific support from the field that we get for the internship called Professional Semester 3.
And so the recognized strength across the country of that program.
And literally across the country, and certainly across Alberta. As recently as yesterday, when I was interviewing principals and vice principals and assistant principals in Calgary Catholic, every one of those focus groups had nothing to do with any question I asked, because all my questions are about education leadership. They kept on coming back to, but you know, these grads we get from the University of Lethbridge, they already know this. So it's just really quite affirming. But anyway, that internship was the same sense. The University of Lethbridge Faculty of Education professors often speak of this term, praxis, the blending of theory into practice. How can we actually put that into reality while we still have some influence over the students, that we can still guide and support? That's where that internship comes into play there as well.
But from the way I understand it, at the graduate level, there's more self-direction, right? It's a shift in a balance, right?
But and to some degree it comes down to it. Even as a student is finishing their Bachelor of Education program with their internship, they're working pretty closely with the mentor-teacher inside of the school. They're taking over the mentor-teacher's classes, classroom. They're still going to have to align to a large degree with what the mentor-teacher would like to achieve. And it should be that way. I mean, those are the masters. These guys are still learners. At the MEd level, experienced teachers are the ones I'm working with. They have a much deeper sense, perhaps, of their own abilities and how they can take that theory and apply it. Therefore, it works. It works to be much more independent. Yes.
Right. We were talking before the interview started about your research in Calgary, and I'd love to go back to that. You were talking about the different levels of experience that people have. Can you tell me more about that? I suppose?
The conversation yesterday in Calgary with, I had a focus group of principals, I had a focus group of vice principals, and in Calgary Catholic they have a third level of school-based administration called assistant principals. Not all school divisions have that. And it was really quite striking in the course of the conversation how deep the principal's knowledge, how deep it was connected to almost every facet of every question that I asked. They had a pulse on everything that I wanted to know about their practice of educational leadership, their understanding of where this new standard is going to take them, which is called the Leadership Quality Standard, and also how their teachers were coming to know what this new teaching quality standard was all about. When I had a conversation with vice principals, they had a pretty good understanding, but it wasn't as deep as the principal's understanding. And then when I spoke to the assistant principals, and for the most part they're in the role 1 year, maybe 2 years, they're beginning, they're neophytes. They have an understanding, they kind of know what's going there, but their depth is nowhere near what the principals were. And that was hugely important for me. And this is the neat connection then between what I go out and do as a researcher, and those interviews were taking part because my colleague Dr. Adams, we're working with our fellow researchers from the University of Calgary. We've got a group of researchers from the University of Alberta and a researcher from Concordia University in Edmonton. The four universities are partnering in taking a 4-year look at the implementation of these new standards in the province of Alberta. So by me having this focus group, now I come back and once again we'll start to work with my interns who are going out into the school, who in many ways would be more or less at the level of these assistant principals. And it comes to the point of reminding me, I think they know a fair bit about theory already. But they don't perhaps know as much as I think they might know. And it just reminds me again that when I'm working with these beginning leaders, to be patient, to listen deeply, to be there for them when they reach out to me, to be accessible when little hiccups occur, and they will occur. And it was a nice reminder for me yesterday.
When you were telling me about that, I was thinking about my own sort of teaching practice and about teaching here at the university in that kind of layered system. And that often I think when we come in as teachers, we're focused on, well, often first on the I'm teaching as opposed to their learning, but on the specific class. And then it, you know, as I sort of matured in my role here, I found you start thinking about, oh, you know, the majors in your program, like the curriculum in a wider sense, and as you continue more, like the program and its relationship to the wider university. That shows really the value of experience is, I guess, what I was getting to there. Yeah, I think that sounds really interesting. And then I love that you're taking it back and thinking, how can I apply this research to my educational practice here in the university? And
how it can help refine me still as a teacher who's been doing this for almost 40 years.
Absolutely. The experience doesn't
stop. And sometimes, you know, we need reminders and we need refocus. And also what I find truly fascinating is it's 10 years that I've been away from being a formal school leader. And I'm teaching education leadership. And I have a wealth of practice, much of which was from 20 and 30 years ago. That is not current by any stretch of the imagination. By actively researching in this area of educational leadership and spending a wealth of time in conversation, working directly with principals, vice principals, assistant principals, teachers, I come to know the current practice of school.
Right.
So then, as I'm starting to come to my own determinations as to what theory truly underpins this practice of educational leadership, I'm getting it from the reality of what's happening in Alberta schools today. Not from my own practice, even though I was a reasonably, or some would even say highly successful school principal. The school then is not the school now. And I got to remind myself of that regularly.
Well, and I think that's, I mean, for many of us who are teaching at the university, that is an ongoing question of how does excellence in teaching change over time in relation to our students? So do you see our students here at the university changing and having different needs than even when you started here?
Yes and no. Yes to a certain degree, and I'll go to the no part quickly, and why I also said no, is that I only have 10 years in. And it was enough that just begin to see a bit of a transition with our students. And the area where I think as university teachers, our greatest challenge has been over the course of the last 10 years, as I listened to my colleagues around this university speak, was an extension of the K-12 world and what they went through more or less starting 20 years ago, but to some degree are still going through, and it's all around the role of student assessment.
Okay.
When I remember attending a number of teaching center-sponsored events here at the university of professors coming together and talking about, you know, and it would often put it in the form of rigor and whether students work hard enough and whether students are passing their tests. And it seemed to be the only real way to come to know what a student knows is by testing them.
Right.
And I've noticed a transition in that over my 10 years of being here. That we now are open to, I think, more broadly as a group of university educators, of different ways in which students can show what they know.
Right.
That we don't always have to default back to a test.
Right.
Student writing, student conversation is just as important. Group work has become a more valued element within our university teaching, but also ways in which now I see our colleagues starting to come to an understanding of how do we assess group work?
Right.
What role does that play?
Yes.
So I think that's one transition that I've noticed here, but that's a continuation of what our students have come to expect because of their K-12 expectation and their experience.
I wasn't thinking of it as in terms of assessment, but as you say that, I realize how much I've shifted my own assessment practices over the years. So absolutely. And in terms of your assessment here in the university, is that something you have also changed?
Fortunately, when I joined the university, I had spent a lifetime of changing that practice within high school. And I have to say, I fought the battles of working with some pretty traditional views on what student assessment was all about when I was a high school principal. Years ago, and we're almost going 15 years ago, I had mandated no kid can get a 0 on anything.
Oh, that was a controversial thing here in Alberta.
It is a massively, but it wasn't controversial with me. If we come to an understanding that student assessment is about me as a teacher, in some way coming to know what the student knows or can do or understands. By a student not handing something in, it tells me nothing about what the student knows or doesn't know.
Right.
It just tells me the student didn't hand it in. So for me as a teacher to hand in a grade of 0 because the student didn't hand something in violates a fundamental principle of assessment. I assign a mark, a grade, that doesn't apply to anything.
Right.
So I would violate my own conscience in many respects. So as long as I kept it at that level in my conversations with a whole bunch of angry teachers at the time, the anger quickly passed.
Right.
So at a certain point, particularly as being a high school principal, it comes down to the what if question. Well, what if we don't know enough to be able to assign a student some version of a grade at the end of the course? Well, then I said it's very simple. Then we don't assign a grade. Until we know enough as the professional about what we think we know the student can do, or has the ability for, we don't put anything down.
I might want to play devil's advocate a little bit here because I want to hear you expand on that. I think in the popular culture, that was taken as letting students slide through and teaching students that they can be irresponsible and that we need to teach them responsibility. And if they don't submit, they will, they need to suffer the natural consequences, we might say. Tell me why I'm wrong.
And you are. and really what it comes down to it is we just use those as cop-out excuses of trying to get every kid to do the same thing in the same way. That we're really not forcing ourselves as the teacher to come to understand it from the student perspective and to get the student to be able to demonstrate their own learning in particular ways. And once we get past this idea that we have to assign a mark for absolutely everything that a student does, then we can quickly lean over to what do I need to get back from that student to be able to know what the student knows, can do, has the ability for. And then it flips the paradigm.
But I don't want my surgeon to have never passed his tests. If I go in for surgery, I want that.
And within a little old K-12 scenario, a student would never get out of a high school class if a student never took a test.
Right.
Because we don't have enough to be able to say that student knows X% of this course material. So it all comes back to that final element of coming to know what the student knows. And as long as we stay consistent with it, we can get students to come there. I have students on a regular basis that don't finish my graduate courses at the preordained date that the registrar sets for a course to end.
Right.
And we continue to work with them outside of that. Ultimately, what I want to know with my graduate student, does that student have that knowledge, or does that student have the ability? Can the student do that? And if I can answer yes at the end of the day, I'm fine with that.
Yes. And
we continue to work with them.
I was playing devil's advocate. And I think I'm not a very good actor either. I think you could tell I was playing. That's interesting because it is one of those things where there's a kind of popular response that can be really about, sort of a law and order response. And then I think when you understand it a little more clearly about actually that our job is facilitating learning, it becomes tricky. For me, where that gets tricky in my classrooms, I often teach quite different classes than you, bigger classes, that I really want to be careful that I'm treating all students fairly, which isn't exactly the same as treating them all exactly the same.
Exactly.
But also, I have limited ways to assess a class of 100's knowledge, right? So in that case, I think it's slightly different.
Yeah, and it's a bigger challenge.
Yes.
It's not undoable, it's just a different challenge.
Right.
And one that I fully appreciate.
Right. That's really interesting. I'm glad we got to that. Maybe we can shift a little bit now and I wanted to ask you about what's a challenge for you to teach? What's really challenging in terms of education and teaching at both the graduate and undergraduate levels?
I think as far as course content would be concerned, I wouldn't put anything into the challenge area because I spent a lifetime of studying in this area, but then also a lifetime of practicing in the area. My challenge is simply remaining current, that I'm actually providing the service to the students that they actually need. And it almost goes back to a little bit of what I was mentioning earlier in our conversation about 10 years away from being an active school principal.
Right.
And 15 years from teaching at the K-12 level, because the last few years when I was principal, I was no longer teaching. Right. School was too big. So how do I remain current? And it's part of where my research has come to aid me, but yet it's still, I'm watching. I'm watching others do.
Right.
I'm watching others teach. I'm watching others lead and coming to understand what's necessary by watching them do that. And so far, I think I've been able to come to know and come to understand what it is that's really important about what they're doing within the changing context and changing dynamics of their lives, and be able to bring it into my teaching both at the undergraduate level and the graduate level.
Right.
I found it challenging, and I mentioned earlier that I'm part of a curriculum working group that's helping to redesign the new K-12 Alberta Social Studies program of studies. And I was listening to the practicing teachers who would sit around the table with me as we debate some idea or whether this element or this concept should be embedded into this new curriculum. And I'm thinking, maybe I need to do a little bit more work in this area. So so that's a bit of a challenge. So then if I get to teach the social studies for non-majors class again, and particularly as the entire curriculum changes,
right,
then I start to question, can I bring great service to my students?
Right.
Or perhaps am I teaching more from a book rather than from the experience that's really necessary for the students?
Right.
So that worries me. It worries me. And maybe when that day happens, old guy, almost 40 years in, perhaps that's the time to start considering retirement, but I'm not quite there yet.
I really don't think of it in quite the same way. I think there's a real advantage to that seniority, and I think when you're asking those kinds of questions about your relevance, that's what it takes to stay relevant myself. But certainly I do find myself sometimes thinking, this 20-year-old article was foundational, they need to read it. And then, okay, maybe I need to let that go.
But there are some 20-year-old articles that they need to read,
right?
because
It's
it is
foundational. Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
It's definitely a balance of knowing the wider field and the current changes to it.
And that's the key, the changes to it. Even in the area of educational leadership, what is not covered within the current standard, and we sort of pay cursory review of, is this whole expansion into almost like what would be a cultural understanding of the world, the impact of race and the way in which people see the world. So much of what has been written about in education leadership, I almost have to say, from a person sitting in his chair, old white men.
Right.
Well, that has changed dramatically. And as much as I can also be sympathetic and understanding and try to explore, and I read extensively into the whole race theory understanding, I'm still an old white man. And it becomes incumbent upon me to dig even deeper and deeper into those areas so that we can expand the program perhaps into areas that we never even would have considered 10 and 15 years ago. Right.
Well, and that goes back, I think, to the inclusivity question, because there are things that we as, white people, you as male, have less access to understanding, or understanding in a theoretical way, but not a practical way. And so how you make space for those other understandings of the world, I think, are really important. And do you mean that that's changing the curriculum planning?
It's certainly changing the conversations I have with my fellow instructors within the educational leadership specialization.
Right.
We talk about that.
Right.
Because we have to come to an understanding of it. One of the items, and as you probably get the sense of what I do when I'm questioning something in my own life, is I go out and I work with schools.
Right.
And the whole understanding of the placement of immigrant populations, which also has an extension into race theory and how it's going to apply. I had a wonderful opportunity just about 3 years ago to actively volunteer with the Calgary Islamic School, which was an independent school up until a few years ago, and then it became part of Palliser School Division as an alternate program. And 100% of the students within that school are primarily immigrant, children themselves, or children of first-generation Canadians. Wealth of languages spoken throughout the building.
Right.
Wealth of races represented throughout the building, and also with the teaching staff. And I had the good fortune of being wise enough, perhaps at this age in my life, of spending as much time listening while I was in that building as I ever did talking and guiding the leaders through some understanding of what to do to run a school. And the leaders within that building, when it came to the understanding of religion, culture, race, were the experts.
Right.
When it came to how do we put together a program that might reflect the current need of the Alberta Program of Studies, they relied upon me. But it really became a neat symbiotic relationship where I could grow and learn. Hopefully, I think in this case, maybe even more so than they did, but hopefully in a similar way.
I have many friends in the Islamic community here in Lethbridge, and I've worked with some of the young people in terms of their experience of the schools, and I'm especially interested in how that has played out in the teaching community here. I didn't know you were involved in that. In Lethbridge, it seems quite different to me than it would be at an Islamic school in Calgary, because, well, is it quite different, and how do you see those differences?
I think it goes from the entire experience of these children's lives within Calgary Islamic School itself is centered on an understanding of their relationship with the faith and how it plays out in their day-to-day learning.
Right.
Within schools in Lethbridge, it's ancillary. Their experience inside of school is to learn like any other kid,
right,
the Alberta Program of Studies.
Right.
But they also have a certain amount of other learning that they want to attend to, and just simply their existence. And they got to make sense of it really on their own.
Right.
The children within the Calgary Islamic School are making sense of it
in an Islamic context.
And also in conjunction with teachers who understand, with principals who understand, and are of the same faith and are leading them within that context as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course in Lethbridge, not all of the Islamic students are either new Canadians or refugees, but a big proportion of them are and have been in the last couple of years, and that is my experience working with the refugee community.
Nice.
And I think that ends up having multiple other challenges for the student learners and also for the teachers who may be unfamiliar with that experience. Is that becoming an increasing part of our education curriculum here in the faculty in terms of diversity education?
It's always been there, but what changes is diversity, and what does it mean?
Right.
That becomes the change. We know, as we continue to take increasing numbers of refugees into the country, coming to understand the particular nature of the current group of refugees, because that changes almost every generation.
Well, especially in Toronto, where I'm from. You mentioned being there.
Gracious, yes, massive.
Yeah.
But even here in Alberta, where we've been, in certain communities have been designated where they almost become almost settlement areas for different refugee groups. For the longest time, Lethbridge was really centered for the whole grouping coming out of Nepal and the
Bhutanese.
The Bhutanese, thank you. And teachers, particularly in Lethbridge Public, but I think in Holy Spirit as well, had to become experts not only in refugee children and their learning needs, but what about culture? What about language? What about understanding? What about faith? What about religion connected to that very particular group of students? So then it becomes quite challenging with the faculty, because of course our students go all over Alberta, certainly all over Western Canada. Is you can't teach the particulars, but you have to give the skill set to be able to come to know, so that when you're there, you got to find out on your own.
I think that's so important, because they are going to have to adapt in future years as teachers. It's not always going to be this population. But it goes right back to your first point, which is that in some way excellence in teaching for you is about getting to know the individual needs of your students.
Yes.
And so maybe I want to circle around back to that. For you, what do you think excellence in teaching looks like? And is that different at the different stages? Maybe we can parse out what it looks like in post-secondary and what it looks like in K-12.
And partly I knew you were going to ask that question. And I want to put it into a context. Within our program at the master's level, we teach all the way back to Malcolm Knowles and his concept of andragogy. Adult learning principles is really what comes down to it. And we really want to reinforce with these school leaders who are going to go and become principals that adults and children and everything that we do to help them learn have certainly some similarities, but they're not the same. I get challenged by my students all the time around that concept, because maybe 15 years ago, when we hadn't introduced at the K to 12 level such a plethora of ways of helping children to come to know this world and really have come to understand different learning needs, this whole idea of equity, an understanding of inclusion, an understanding of differentiated assessment, that perhaps what we did was take some of the ideas that Knowles had around adult learning and we applied them to kid learning, pedagogy.
Okay.
And so we so that there's less of a difference between the two.
Can we talk about Knowles before, just to give a little context there? What do you mean by his theories of adult learning?
Well, Malcolm Knowles was very clear with that if you're going to be working with a group of adults, that A, they're self-starters.
Right.
That B, they need to be able to make sense of the world around them from the way in which they see it. See, that they're going to approach learning in such a way that they're going to take control over it and understand what they want to get out of it. And they're not about to start learning something new if they don't see value in this new way of doing it.
Right.
And in other words, give them the majority of the control. And if you think back to our K to 12 context and understanding, we have a program of studies that says this is what students need to learn.
Right.
It is the teacher's responsibility how best to get the kid to learn it. Somehow the kid is left out of that mix.
Right.
Whereas in adult learning context, the adult has to be actively integrated into that almost bit of a circle here.
Right.
That's the tricky part.
Okay.
But we're doing that more and more with children.
Right.
We're actually getting them to take more ownership of their own learning. Adults need to have ownership of their own learning. So now where it gets a little bit complicated at university is we understand we still have a body of knowledge, so to speak, that we would like our students to leave the university with.
Right.
But students are going to make sense of that in their own way. And in their own time and really to their own degree.
Right.
And as teachers, we have to understand that. So that really the fundamentals of teaching, I believe at the university is, understand what it is we would like students to know, but then to bring students into the equation of them being able to determine depth of focus, depth of understanding, which particular parts are really important to them and whether they want to take it. And then to be able to come across with assessment routine that will allow them to demonstrate to their greatest ability what it is so that we can ultimately assign some mark to this, that we're not assessing students all in the same way with the same tool. And then at the same time being able to organize class structure in such a way that students are able to integrate and interact with one another on a regular basis, that they learn better together than they do as individuals, which again gets complicated when you're teaching classes of 100 or 200 or 500.
We have our methods, but yes.
Yes. But that becomes important learning.
Yeah.
And it really comes back and centered on my job as teacher is to know them.
Right.
Not them to know me.
Well, that seems like just a perfect place to end. You've expressed that so clearly and in so many different ways in this conversation. It's been a pleasure for me to get to know you, and I think to learn from you and hopefully carry some of those, some of that inspiration into my own classroom. So thank you, Carmen.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, Anne.
Thank you.